mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Mike Brazier, and today we're going to have a topic that's a little bit different from some of the other things that we typically discuss. I'm joined in studio here by a friend of mine and a professional colleague, Dr. Orin Robinson from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Orin, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you're here today because, I guess you're here in anticipation of a waterfowl science symposium that we're having here in Memphis next week. And I seized the opportunity to have you come into our headquarters here. Just a little while ago, you gave a presentation to our staff, both here as well as remotely. Had a ton of people join, and the topic that you talked about there was eBird. It's an application that you're going to tell us all about. Some of our listeners may have heard about it, but mostly it's associated, most of the people that would be real familiar with it would be classified as bird watchers. But there are a lot of waterfowl hunters, me included, you included, that are familiar with this application and use it for a variety of reasons, personal reasons, for our personal interest. A lot of us in this field use it for professional reasons in terms of kind of helping us understand bird ecology, to inform some conservation planning and things of that nature. And so we're going to talk mostly about eBird as we get through this episode. But to begin with, I want you to introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us where you grew up, some of your hobbies, how you became interested in birds, and then kind of where you are now. So go for it. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Orin Robinson. I'm from Mobile, Alabama. Originally went to school at Auburn University. Did a master's degree at the University of South Alabama on brown pelican nesting ecology, and did a PhD at Rutgers University in New Jersey on using mathematical models in conservation applications. And from there, I went back to Auburn University, worked with USGS co-op there at Auburn and the Black Duck Joint Venture on black duck population studies. And then I went to Cornell University, and I have been there for a little over 6 years now, and I'm still there.
I want you to back up a little bit before your college days. Tell us about your childhood, your upbringing. You grew up in Mobile. You're a Southerner. You grew up like most Southern. I think you were telling me that you grew up in the city, in Mobile, but you got out, you hunted, you fished. Tell us about that. How is that what drew you to the field of conservation science and to the profession that you're in now?
It really is. I, like you said, grew up hunting and fishing, and like most folks who hunt and fish, you're always wondering, well, why are the birds landing over there and not right here? Why do I see deer on days that are, like this or in this situation and not in others? And late in my college career at Auburn, I realized that you could make a career out of trying to answer some of those questions. Yep. And that, that really piqued my interest and kind of shoved me in this direction. Trying to answer those questions. But yeah, from a young age, you're always wondering about that stuff. Maybe not in the the conservation-minded way that we are now, but you want to know those things to make you a better hunter or fisherman.
Yeah, it sparks that sort of intellectual curiosity of the natural world, and at that early age, it's for a lot of us, there's nothing wrong with this. It's for selfish reasons, right?
Absolutely.
Like I want to know why the birds are going there because I want to be able to tell where they're going. I want to know where the deer are. I want to know where to catch the fish. but that requires you to understand the ecology of the species, its interaction with its habitat. And then you, as you said, you become fascinated with that and you realize, holy cow, there's a potential career opportunity here. And so that leads me to kind of wonder, I'm going to learn a few things about you that I didn't previously know. You said that it was late in your college career that you realized that there was a career opportunity there. What were you majoring in prior to that, and what were you thinking that your career path would be?
So my undergraduate degree is in biomedical sciences.
Oh, that's why you're so smart.
Well, you're one of the few people that's ever accused me of being that. So I had to do a research project, and I got put on a research project with a grad student there at Auburn University who was studying gopher tortoises. And I went around with him. He was studying this certain hormone in gopher tortoises, but in order to do that, you got to catch them. And in order to catch them, you got to know where they are. And I got super interested in that and was asking him, why do we find them over here? Do they like this certain plant? It seems like burrows are near this type of bush or something like that. And he went, man, you should have been in ecology. And at that point, I didn't even know what ecology was. Yeah. Like you said, I'd been thinking about it my whole life as a hunter and a fisherman, but I didn't know
ecologist without knowing it.
Right. And that's kind of what put that into my head.
That's pretty cool. And so you and I first met sometime around 2018, 2017, something of that nature. I was back when I was down at the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, and that was about the time where eBird was becoming more widely known and more widely used for various migratory bird conservation planning applications. And we reached out. We wanted to learn a little bit more about it, and we had some conversations. Then we had a meeting together, and it was at that time that you invited me to go hunting with your dad and a friend of your dad's and friend of yours in Arkansas. And it was at that moment that I said, this guy is really smart. He's super quantitatively inclined. He knows all this data, and he's a duck hunter. I need to stay close to this guy. He can help us out with a lot of things. And so I kind of revealed part of my motive for for interacting with you in a variety of these different meetings and these different projects. We do have some projects that we're working on together, some collaborations between DU and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which I'm really excited about, some potential to use all the really cool applications, the data that y'all are collecting to help us do a better job now and certainly going forward with our understanding of waterfowl migrations or just waterfowl ecology in general, and then how we can incorporate that new understanding into conservation planning. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that we're thinking about and moving towards. And so a lot of it, as I said, revolves around data collected through eBird. Before we get to eBird, I'm going to give you an opportunity here for people that may not have heard about it, may not be familiar with it, to talk about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's world-renowned, but y'all have really taken it to another level here over the past 15 or maybe even 20 years, but certainly the last 15 years that I can see in terms of your use and application of big data from the bird world. So tell us, for those that may not be familiar with it, briefly about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology.
Yeah, so the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is part of Cornell University. There's also it also operates as a nonprofit organization. It is, my little corner of it is the conservation and working on the models and things like that with the big data. But there is a ton of other things going on there. There's there's a lot of evolution studies that come out of there. There's the Macaulay Library, which hosts millions and millions of photos and sounds from the that are recorded by scientists and citizen scientists. There is the citizen science arm, the social sciences side of the lab. Education, K through 12 education. There's a large group that works on that. I'm sure I'm forgetting things, but there is a lot of things related to the bird world going on there, other than the few things that I work on.
So you mentioned citizen science. You mentioned some of these other different data sets, and I don't think it's any secret that it was the development of mobile phones, the kind of the modern smartphones, that opened the door in a massive way to the type of data that y'all are collecting now. And although we've talked before about waterfowl hunters, and others in the community being some of the original citizen scientists, ordinary people, you might say, that are contributing data for scientific purposes. When you call in and report a band, you're contributing data. You're a, quote, citizen scientist. When you report a neck collar on an observed goose or something like that, that's a, quote, citizen science observation. It's just we've termed it, that phrase is, a term has been coined probably in the last 15 years or something like that. And the advent of smartphones has just blown open the door in terms of the ability for a whole host of people to collect and help contribute data to institutions like Cornell and a whole host of others. There's a number of applications out there that people can download to their app that would fall into this category. iNaturalist is one. eBird is one. There's a ton of different ones. I don't know them all. I'm not going to try to name them all. But when we say citizen scientists, that's kind of what we're talking about. Ordinary people that in one way or another are collecting data and submitting it in sort of a curated, in a standard way that's being curated, and it is then used for scientific purposes, right?
Yes.
So talk to us about eBird. That's the big topic here. When did that come about, roughly speaking? And I realize you haven't been at Cornell for the entire length of that application being available, but to your understanding of sort of the history of that, just kind of describe that to us and kind of tell us what eBird is.
Yeah, so eBird is, it's a platform that tries to harness the want of birders to go out and observe as many species as they can and record it. It started in the early 2000s. It has, like you said, it has really taken off recently. It continues to grow every year. The platform itself is very easy to use. Prior to the smartphone app, folks would go and put in their recordings online, but it also records things like where you were, how long you were out there, how far you traveled while you were looking for these birds, and things like that really help us use that data, right? Because it gives us an idea of the effort that was put into your birding.
And by effort, you mean how long you spent on your bird watching adventure or your trek that day.
Right, because it's if it takes you longer to find a given species in one habitat than it does in another, that gives us information about the species preferences for that habitat, things like that.
Potentially the relative abundance. If you go out and spot 5 cardinals in 2 minutes, then chances are that there's going to be a greater abundance of cardinals than if it took you an hour to spot 5 or something. Is that fair?
Yeah.
If you're kind of moving type thing. Okay. So, and it's an application that you can access. It's eBird, just small e, capital BIRD.
Yes.
And it's an application that you can download to your phone. It's also an application that you can access through a laptop or any other kind of desktop application,
yes,
right?
eBird.org.
eBird.org. I have it on my phone. I have an eBird account. I'm not the best contributor of most frequent contributor. It's seasonal. I think you were talking about that earlier in that sort of the activity level that people invest in bird watching and recording their observations is seasonal, and I fall into that category as well. And so as we get into this, we'll be kind of tempted to get into some technical areas. Like you just gave a 40-minute presentation with visual aids and talking about showing all these graphs and all these different maps. We obviously can't do that with a podcast, so we'll try to avoid some of the more technical aspects of it that would benefit from kind of visual aids. But I do want to talk about the application for those people that may not be aware of it. Like just generally speaking, what does it consist of? Like I have eBird on my app or on the eBird app on my phone. If I wanted to use it, what do I do, and what are the basics that I need to know?
Yeah, so you will download that eBird app. It'll be linked to your eBird account, and you click a button that says Start a Checklist, and it will keep track of the time for you. It will track where you go if you want it to. And
some of those things are controllable. You can it's kind of a privacy issue. You give the user the ability to dictate how much information y'all are collecting about them.
Definitely. And then you'll have a list of birds for the region you're in. You can download different packs, like if you're traveling, because those things take up a lot of space. You don't just automatically have all the birds of the world on there. So if you're, traveling to South America, you could download the bird list from that region. You'll have that on your phone, on the eBird app, and you start counting birds as you move around. When you stop, eBird will ask you a few questions. How long were you out there? How far did you go? If you've got, your phone's keeping track of that for you, so you don't really have to guess.
But if you've disabled that location service type thing, then it will ask you to approximate the distance, right?
Yes. Okay. Yes, it will. And then you'll answer, one final question. Was this a complete checklist of all the birds you were able to identify? And if you say yes, then that also gives us information about all the birds that were not there to be identified. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those birds weren't there. It just means you did not detect them on that checklist. Some birds are very hard to detect, and even if they're there, you may not see them.
Yeah. And also the expertise level of the observer it varies widely, right? Like There's a lot of, I consider myself a decent birder, and that's a decent birder from sort of an average layperson perspective. A decent birder from the perspective of someone in your lab would probably be totally different than mine. But I consider myself a decent birder. But there's a lot of different species that I can't identify either by sight. Some of the flycatchers are just a pain in the rear, or certainly by their calls. I'm not great at detecting birds by calls. And let me ask you about that. Kind of side note here. If you hear a bird, can you enter that in eBird? And if you do, are you asked to indicate if it was an audible detection only?
Yes, you can enter a bird that you hear. There are a lot of species. So one for me that I get on my property during migration is red-eyed vireo. They have a very distinct call, but they're often at the very tops of trees. Yeah. So I won't say I almost never see them, but 75% of the time I hear them and don't see them. But it's there. Yeah. You know that red-eyed vireo is there because it's singing.
Or you can hear two, or one over here and one over here, and so there's two, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so yes, you can list it if you hear it and you're confident in that ID. You do not have to say, I heard it only. I typically do. When I don't, I'll put it in the comments. I heard it, didn't see it. But it's not a mandate. It's not going to ask you, did you see it or did you just hear it?
And when people submit that checklist, it goes to a database that is curated by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And so you have contributed data to this massive, massive data set. I think I heard you say earlier how many total observations y'all are up to now. What's that number?
It's over 1 billion, but it continues to grow every year. It grows considerably every year, and it's growing at a pretty good rate outside of the United States here too, which is exciting for us because it just means we have more data for more regions to work with. And that's, again, selfishly, that's exciting to have.
Yeah, because it's available for use worldwide. It's available in multiple languages. I don't know how many languages.
It's over 30.
Over 30 different languages. So it's pretty cool to see all of this information come together. And as a person in this field who really likes bird data and sees the use for it, both from a personal standpoint as well as professional conservation planning standpoint, the one thing that we are inherently kind of wired to do as scientists and people in the technical field is to be very strong critics, to criticize. It's part of this peer review process, right? It's Definitely. A very strong desire to ask questions to ensure that the data that we're collecting is accurate, is useful, is valid for whatever application we're using it for. And so I recall some of the first times that I began to learn about eBird, and instantly my critical mind goes into motion, and I start thinking about, well, how do you account for differential expertise levels among the observers? How do you account for the fact that some people just can't identify these birds? And so therefore, that's going to appear as though the bird's not there, but it's not there simply because they can't identify it. There's other potential biases associated with, just the rareness of the bird, or the cryptic coloration of the bird, or the fact that they may not be very vocal, may not be seen very often, and a whole host of other potential biases. And so you talked earlier about a number of those in your presentation, and we're not going to step through all of those, but I've seen you give enough presentations and heard you talk about how you account for those biases to reassure me that you acknowledge those biases and you're doing a hell of a lot of work to account for them in very, very impressive ways. So what I'll do is ask you to talk about the bias that is pointed out to y'all most often and use that as an example of the type of work that y'all go to adjust for those biases.
The bias that gets, a lot of folks immediately come up with is spatial bias. The idea that different locations are eBirded differently in terms of the number of people that are going there at a given time of the year. So,
like major metropolitan areas versus north central, extreme rural Mississippi. Right.
Or, extreme hotspots like Cape May, New Jersey. We get a ton of checklists from there. You can imagine with all the birders at the Lab of Ornithology that Tompkins County, New York is very well represented in the eBird data. So those places have a lot more data coming from them than, like you said, rural Mississippi or something like that. So that is the spatial bias. And one of the ways we begin handling that is to essentially just grid sample the data. If 100 people went to a certain spot to see, a rarity that was there in a given day, we would only use one of those checklists. So it doesn't, more weight isn't given to a certain spot or location than others when we do our analyses.
So that's just one example.
That's just one example.
Yeah, and I know there's all sorts of other really cool ways that y'all tried to account for biases. We can't get into all of those, but the point is that you have a phenomenal team of scientists and colleagues that are thinking about this. You were telling me that one of your earlier jobs and responsibilities within the Cornell Lab was to probe these models, to probe this data set and the products that you're developing, sort of as a to validate, to fact check, for lack of a better word, to make sure that what you're getting is worth using or is reliable, I guess, maybe reliable to the point that it can be used for some of the applications that we're wanting to use it for now, right?
Yes, there's a team there at the lab that does nothing but research and development on these products that we these types of models that we use at the lab. And it's incredible what they come up with year after year. Every year it gets a little better, a little more accurate, a little more user-friendly. It's awesome to be a part of that group.
Orin, we've already been talking here for about 25 minutes, and so I know we have a number of other things that we want to get into, more on the application side of things. I know a lot of our audience is waterfowl hunters, and I want us to talk about that a little bit. Both of us being waterfowl hunters and eBird users, we think about this a lot in terms of the potential utility of eBird for our either personal uses in understanding migration or monitoring migration, and certainly from the science and conservation planning side of things, we think about that a lot. So we want to come back, we want to talk about that, but we'll take a break right now, and then we will finish up the conversation here on the backside of this. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everyone. We're here with Dr. Orin Robinson at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and we're going to pick up our conversation. We're talking about eBird, and we're going to transition away from some of the more technical aspects of it, and we're going to talk about some of the applications of it. And there's a ton of stuff that we could talk about right here. But what I want you to do is highlight one or two of your best examples, most popular examples of how eBird data, these over a billion observations, have been leveraged for, let's just say, pretty cool purposes. That maybe talk about the animated map that is one of the key outputs of this. It really gets people's attention.
Yeah, so that animated map is, we have, I think coming soon will be about 2,500 species of birds that we have modeled their relative abundance at a roughly 3 by 3 kilometer resolution across the globe for every week of the year, and that's a really exciting thing to see. And if you go online through the eBird website, you can find these on the eBird Science tab is where to go look for these, and you can just watch these pixels change colors as the birds move across the hemisphere, throughout the year, throughout their annual cycle.
You've created basically an application that animates the results from all these different observations. And there's a lot of other modeling that goes into it, right? We're not just looking at the raw data.
Right.
Whenever you've seen that animated map, you're looking at the results of some very sophisticated models that take that raw data and then relate it to different landscape characteristics and, across the globe and through time. And you build these spatio-temporal models, right? And so it's really, really cool. That's the other thing we haven't talked about yet, and I'm glad you did, is there are a lot of products produced from all of this data from the Cornell Lab that the average person, anybody, can go to the website, ebird.org, and explore those applications, explore those products. And those animated maps for our audience of waterfowl will be most interesting. Just a couple of weeks ago, I saw our Chief Conservation Officer, Dr. Karen Waldrop, giving a presentation, and she had in her presentation one of the animated maps of northern pintails, and she remarked that this was her favorite slide in the entire presentation because it shows that international cross-boundary migration of northern pintails from the Arctic in Canada into the U.S., into Mexico and Central America, visualizing what we know from decades of science, but nevertheless, this is kind of taking it to a new level that a lot of people, probably the average person, might not appreciate, is just the scale at which those birds move, the distances that they move, and it's just a phenomenal product to visually demonstrate those movements. And y'all have used it to help identify, and other people in the avian community, conservation community, are using those products to identify areas of high importance for different species, right?
Yeah, definitely. And those maps, they're beautiful too. If you're a map nerd like me, I could spend hours just looking at different species maps and how they move. They are fascinating to look at, but there's a lot of information in them as well. And we've been using that information on a number of conservation applications. One that some of your listeners may even be aware of are the bald eagle studies we've been doing with this. One of those studies both of them actually were with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. One of them was looking at their risk maps. So when a wind infrastructure needs to be built, or someone applies to build wind infrastructure, they have to undergo this period of observation that shows that they're not going to be building that in a spot where a lot of eagles may interact with that wind infrastructure. And the map that had been being used was a very coarse, at the state type of level, which kept a lot of wind farms from going forward without this long couple of years worth of observation process. So what we helped them to do was to use our data and our models to put together a map at the 3 by 3 kilometer scale, which is about the scale of one of these wind farms, to show the relative abundance of eagles, to help streamline that process for the wind industry. another project we did with them on bald eagles was to take that data and relate it to a lot of their aerial surveys, their nest counts, things like that, and help fill in where there was a lot of missing data and help them to estimate the abundance of bald eagles across each flyway, and then the overall North American abundance of bald eagles. And that was in the news, 6 months ago, something like that.
Yeah, I think I saw the publication come out, and it's not necessarily replacing the data that the Fish and Wildlife Service has necessarily been collecting. It's supplementing it and increasing our confidence in the understanding of where the birds are, the relative abundance is, and then we can in turn do a better job planning around that, right, to mitigate the risk to those species.
Right. There was another project done with on mottled ducks, just like you're talking about. When the COVID stopped several of the waterfowl surveys from being flown, and we used eBird data and related it to the last 10 or 12 years of the aerial surveys for mottled ducks, across Texas and Louisiana, and were able to use what we learned about those two data sets, their relationship, to essentially predict what those surveys would have seen had they been flown. So you can definitely use eBird in that way as well.
And that mottled duck survey is down on the Gulf Coast, the Western Gulf Coast. I'm quite familiar with that survey. eBird was not used for the larger waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey, across the Dakotas, the prairies, the one that we've been talking so much about here over the past month. eBird was not used, to help kind of fill in a gap in those data points, right? We're just talking about the mottled duck survey down on the Gulf Coast.
Yes, just that very specific mottled duck survey there.
It's not to say that someday there wouldn't be interest in trying to combine data from eBird and that waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey to increase the precision of that kind of stuff, right?
I'm very interested in that.
You and a lot of other people too, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So, there's on the conservation planning side of things, I mentioned that at the outset. That's kind of how you and I first developed a professional relationship, is we were working along the Gulf Coast and a lot of joint ventures that are tied to non-breeding regions, areas important during the non-breeding period, use what we call bioenergetic models to kind of figure out how much habitat we need to be providing to support waterfowl populations in our region. We've talked about bioenergetic models on some previous episodes, and I won't go into those details, but a key part of those models is an understanding of the migration chronology by species of waterfowl in our region. For the initial versions of most of those bioenergetic models, the migration chronology parts of them were based on historical surveys that were conducted at local scales, on-the-ground surveys conducted by states, conducted by federal agencies, either across the landscape or at wildlife management areas or national wildlife refuges. And all of those data were kind of combined to develop these migration curves. When do they arrive? When do they peak? When do they fall off? And you do that, and it kind of gives you this idea of the relative abundance through time of the birds that you need to be supporting. One of the things that we in the waterfowl conservation community have seen is that a lot of agencies and entities are de-emphasizing those local scale surveys. There's still a lot of them that occur, but nothing like it used to be. And so in the joint venture conservation planning arena, we began to think, hey, we need to start, thinking about what's the next set of contemporary data that we're going to need to use, or that we'll be able to use for updating our migration chronology curves in these models, because things are changing. Things have always changed. Changing distributions of waterfowl during winter is certainly a hot topic. We've seen it for decades, Canada geese being the first group of birds that we really saw go through some type of migration change. And so we constantly have to keep track of that and adjust our conservation planning models. And so we began to look at eBird as a potential opportunity or as a potential data set to replace some of those historical ones, with more contemporary data. But then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, one of the first things that we do is kind of probe that data set and say, how accurate are these migration curves based on these observational data from eBird? And so we've been working on a project with you. So talk about that a little bit. You used it as an example in your presentation today about what we're doing to kind of validate eBird data for that waterfowl migration chronology purpose.
Yeah, so that's that's a very reasonable question to ask when you start this. Is essentially how good is it, right? And that's really the question a lot of people want to ask about this, and we have to validate it. That's part of the scientific process there. You don't want to just blindly use this. I think it's good. The folks at the lab think it's good, but we've got to prove that it is. And what we've been doing is taking aerial surveys. So the one project that you mentioned, we used aerial surveys from the Illinois Natural History Survey at the Forbes Biological Field Station there, and lined them up essentially by week with the eBird weekly status models. And what we found was very good agreement, really, between those models for the fall. For that fall migration, the big chunk coming through.
The peaks were about the same. They started arriving about the same time between both data sets. They peaked at about the same time. They fell off at about the same time, right?
Right. And we know, what goes up must come down, right? So they got to come back through there in the spring. And what we were seeing was the Illinois Natural History Survey was not picking up ducks on their surveys in the spring, whereas the eBird survey was showing another big peak of migrators coming back down, or going back up, I guess. Yeah. So again, that's disagreement there between the two sources of data, and
But as you said earlier, it doesn't mean either one of them were wrong.
Right. It's not an issue of which one's right and which one's wrong. What we were able to show was that at that time of the year, those main river channels are flooded. In spring, those main river channels are flooded, and that's what the aerial surveys are flying. So there's no ducks sitting on that fast-moving water. So the aerial surveys were picking up that there are no ducks sitting on the fast-moving water, right?
Yeah.
That you would expect them to find very few birds. Whereas eBirders are not going to go look in a spot where there's no birds. They're going to go find them. Yep. And that's why we see the peak with eBird versus the Illinois aerial surveys. And, that's, to me, that is a great case study on why we need both data sets. Mm-hmm. Because both data sets are really observing different parts of the population at different times a year. And that was a really cool finding, I think, out of that study.
A shout out to our collaborators on that study, Dr. Ariel Fournier with the Illinois Natural History Survey and Dr. Kevin Ringelman down at LSU. They've been instrumental in that, and we still have some work to go. Aaron Yetter, also Illinois Natural History Survey, can't leave him out. But they've been instrumental in that study as well. Feel like I'm probably forgetting someone, but that's always the risk whenever you start naming people. My apologies if I'm forgetting someone. I want to move on here, Orin, to talk about a few other things here before we close this out. There's a lot of other applications for waterfowl that we could explore in this. But I want to, I guess the one that I'll talk about here, I don't know how far we are down this road. Where are we with our use beyond what we just talked about in terms of looking at migration chronology throughout the year? Where are we in being able to use eBird data to potentially look at changes in waterfowl migration over time through years? What any work going on there, and where do we stand on that?
So, to my knowledge, there has not been any specific work done on waterfowl and migration change using eBird data. Like I said, the eBird project itself only started in the early 2000s. So, as of right now, there's really no long-term data there to see that long-term shift in migration.
Prior to the early 2000s, right?
Right, yeah. Right. So that's a difficult thing to tease out right now using eBird data. So there have been some examples of phenological mismatch using eBird data. And what that is that migratory birds seem to arrive on the breeding grounds in order, or as they migrate, they may arrive at a stopover or a breeding ground to take advantage of some resource. And a lot of the times that'll be, the green up of certain species of trees and the bugs that might attract. So the phenological mismatch is when the birds arrive and that has either already happened or hasn't happened yet. And that could play a role in changing migratory habits for a species.
Or it could have consequences for nutritional condition of the birds as they go back north.
Absolutely.
If they arrive, if the green up occurs before they arrive, then perhaps they have arrived later than the time at which, let's say, the nutritional or the protein content is highest in some of that greening vegetation. That's one of the hypotheses, right?
Right. And they have missed that, resource pulse that they may be relying on to help drive the rest of their migration. Migrations is expensive energetically, and they need that.
Yeah.
So there have been some examples of that using eBird data in smaller passerine birds, but not in waterfowl, to my knowledge.
You're a waterfowl hunter. I'm a waterfowl hunter. We both use eBird. Do you use the eBird application when you're out hunting? Do you record your observations?
I do. I record, the waterfowl we see. Also, you're always hearing, this species of woodpecker or have cardinals or certain sparrows that'll fly over. So yes, I do. I record.
Do your hunting partners think you're weird?
Well, they think that anyway.
This is a great answer.
Yeah, that just, adds to the
I think it's awesome. I increasingly it's we have a coworker here who's gotten a kick out of her husband's newfound appreciation and fascination with migratory birds, notably hummingbirds here recently, and so she was just telling us about that today. And so I think the increased availability of knowledge about the fascination of migration, and that it's not just waterfowl, to our audience, it's not just waterfowl that undertake these incredibly impressive migratory feats. And in fact, it's some of the other groups of birds that, to me, their migratory feats are even more astounding and impressive, because waterfowl are big-bodied birds. They can pack on a lot of fat, a lot of calories. That's also one of the reasons why they may not have to migrate as far, But insectivorous birds, their food resource up here is gone. Like a lot of our barn swallows and other aerial insectivorous birds are already way south in South America. And so I don't know. There's just the more information, and I think of applications like eBird and the products y'all have developed, GPS telemetry, all sorts of new technology have helped people appreciate the astounding feat of migration that all different types of birds take. And so I think there's a growing interest in migratory bird ecology in general, and I think it would be awesome if we could get more waterfowl hunters to participate in some of these types of things. Do you record the number of waterfowl that you see as well during your times out hunting?
I do.
And so I have a question for you in that regard. One of the parts of the eBird kind of data collection effort is like how long you've been out there doing it. And I think I've heard some of your colleagues at Cornell say you don't like it, or you prefer people don't record observations over a period longer than 2 hours or something. Is there anything like that? Am I misremembering something, or tell me about that?
Yeah, so it's we prefer more short checklists, and that's because it helps. So short in the time you've spent birding, and short in the distance you travel. So if you're going to go on a 15-mile hike, you can make checklists all along that 15-mile hike, but just maybe start another one every mile or so. That really helps us with positional accuracy when we go to model these things.
Because you're modeling the occurrence and abundance of a bird with some landscape variables that y'all can pull from other data sets, right?
Yes, and if we're off on that a little bit, then we may not be as accurate as possible.
So when you're hunting then, this is great, because I've always kind of wondered this, and I didn't really know the answer on how to do it. So when you're hunting, you will maybe take 5 minutes here, maybe take 10 minutes there, maybe it's a lull in in the flight activity for waterfowl, and that would be the time where you would do your birding for whatever the bird you might observe or hear, right? And then maybe you do 3 or 4 of those over the course of the morning, right?
Right.
So, Orin, one of the questions naturally that waterfowl hunters may be concerned about if they're recording observations of waterfowl at their hunting location is they may be concerned about other people learning of that. Have you had any instances? Have you heard of any instances of somebody losing they're having lost out on a particular hunting location or having someone else discover a secret spot in response to eBird observations or anything of that nature? What can you tell people to sort of ease some of their concerns?
So I have not heard of that happening. A person would have to do some serious sleuthing on the eBird site to be able to determine where you were, what you saw, and that kind of thing. And to my knowledge, it's that has not been an issue where someone has gone in and stolen someone's hunting spot because of their eBird checklists.
Anything else kind of on that front from a waterfowler perspective with regard to eBird, how you found it useful, what's particularly exciting to you about it? Anything we need to share?
I think we've covered the highlights there. It's I just enjoy using it. It also, it's almost like keeping a field notebook as well. So you could look back over your observations from a year before if you're keeping track in eBird and see, what time of year you started seeing more birds at your given location. Or something like that, and you can look across years at I was, they were here a week earlier that year. That was weird, or something like that. To help you out a little bit.
Because when you create an account, that's your own personal account, and as you said, it's your personal record. You can look back through however long you're involved in associated with that, or you have that eBird account to look at those observations, right?
Right.
That's really cool. What I want to do is kind of move on real quickly before we close out to mention at least one other application that Cornell has produced and has put out there. I have it on my phone. I am a huge fan of it. There's a couple of others that people that are active on social media. If they follow Ducks Unlimited, they've probably seen us reference. One is BirdCast. The other real noteworthy thing that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is associated with is Birds of the World, collection of species profiles of birds all across the world. I use those often. They're a phenomenal resource. BirdCast is something people can look into. It tries to predict, I think you were saying earlier, on any given day or any given night, the biomass of birds migrating through the airspace. It uses radar, weather radar data, and the coolest application that I've seen for that here recently is like from mitigating or minimizing risk to birds is this lights out Houston, lights out Dallas. Maybe I'll get you. I'm getting kind of excited talking about that. Maybe say a few words about that. That's a really cool application of big data to help mitigate risk to birds.
Right. One of the big, threats to migrating birds is window strikes. And, you go through New York City the morning after a big migration event, and you will find, warblers and others that have been, killed by running into windows. And those lights, they disorient them. They make the window a lot less visible while they're up there flying. In these lights out campaigns, they use BirdCast to determine when there's going to be a very large migration event near or that's going through a given city, and they will have all the buildings, hopefully, turn their lights off to make it easier for birds to recognize that that's a building. And that's just a fantastic use of that BirdCast.
I know Audubon is real active in promoting that Lights Out campaign, and it's that's a remarkable application of data to help us better manage the resource. The other thing, just from a bird watching and kind of hobbyist, and well, not necessarily just hobbyist, but eBird perspective as well, is that BirdCast kind of gets people excited about these big migration events. You and I were talking about that, and I can tell you that it's whenever I see those alerts, BirdCast alerts, big migration alerts, I can count on seeing a lot of new migrants in our backyard the next day. And so, yeah, I kind of gear some of my bird watching activities around that. Do you do that as well?
I do. I like to pay attention. If you're on social media and you follow anybody from the lab, you'll see that.
Yeah.
Oh, get out in the morning because there's a lot of birds coming, And
I think it's pretty amazing how accurate that is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The other kind of subset of those migrants that we won't talk too much about here, but is like waterfowl migration. Can we use BirdCast yet to identify big migrations of waterfowl? Do we know anything about that? We're not there yet necessarily on a species level?
Yeah, we're definitely not on a species level, right? Because, it's radar data and it can't necessarily determine species, right? And it's what it's doing is measuring biomass. If it's a bunch of geese, then that's going to be the same biomass as
10 times the number of smaller birds, right?
A couple hundred, yellow warblers, right? Yeah. So what you really kind of need to do is know what species are migrating at what time to tell you. This is not waterfowl. This is those smaller birds because they tend to migrate with some exceptions, but they tend to migrate at different times of the year.
I'm confident that we'll one day get there with some finer scale radar data. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know. I don't know, but most every other piece of technology that we have is advancing, and so it's reasonable to think that we will get to a point where we're closer to being able to identify to species or family groups or something like that sometime in the future. But kind of fingers crossed that we do. The last thing we'll talk about here, and it's what I wanted you to talk about here a few minutes ago, is the Merlin app, mobile app that people can download to their phone, their smartphones. Merlin, fantastic app that the Cornell Lab has put out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Merlin is great. It is an app that helps you identify birds, whether it's one you are looking at. You can go into Merlin and say, help me ID this bird, essentially. And it will ask you a handful of questions. How big is the bird? What are the main colors on the bird? What was it doing? Where did you see it? Did you see it soaring? Did you see it sitting on a fence post? Something like that. And then it will help you, based on your location, help you figure out what bird. It may not give you a single bird and say it's this, but it'll give you a few options and say these are the birds that match that description. And then you can go from there, trying to figure out which one of those it is. It also allows you to load a picture. So if you have a picture of a bird, I have to confess, I get sent a lot of pictures of what is this bird, and sometimes I throw that picture into Merlin to help me be sure of my identification. So you can do that as well, and so if it's a picture. I'm up there in New York, but I have a lot of family and friends still in Alabama. So if somebody sends me a picture from Alabama, I can say this is from Alabama. It's not from New York, because it might, if it uses my location, it might think I'm trying to ID a bird in New York that's not supposed to be around, and it won't even give me that as an option. So it's got picture ID. A relatively new feature is sound ID.
And that's the part that I'm most excited about. I've used it. It's amazing.
I use it. I use it often. And what it does is it will, you can have it running, and it will essentially listen to the birds near enough to you for it to pick up and ID the birds by song. And it has helped me find birds. I was talking about this earlier today, right? I was out in my yard and heard Merlin picked up a great crested flycatcher earlier in the spring, and I had not seen or heard one. Mm-hmm. And when I saw that Merlin identified a great crested flycatcher, well, of course that tuned me into that, I started listening for it and found it, and eventually, heard it a couple times and saw it. So Merlin will absolutely help you find things that you may not have seen without it.
It was a game changer for me when I was birding earlier this year, and it was a warbler migration in the spring, and it was a game changer in me being able to identify, to detect through just the listening of the app. A Tennessee warbler. I'm not good with bird calls. Tennessee warbler, Blackburnian warbler, and so I just have that thing going, and multiple others, and I have it going, and it shows it up, and I say, it helps reinforce any kind of rudimentary understanding of those calls as well. I was able to detect and start looking for and then see some of those warblers that it was picking up. And I was like, holy cow, it blew me away as to how well it was doing. Now, it identified some birds that I was scratching my head on. I was like, I'm not so sure about that. I would have to see that one, like a cerulean warbler. Yeah. It could have been, but I would have had to have seen it to make sure. And I know there are still some concerns with that. This is artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, right? That people have, that the Macaulay library that you talked about, right? That's where a lot of these expert verified calls that have been recorded and kind of linked to a specific species go into that library, and they're basically the source of the data that have trained the models that are behind the app, right? Yep. Yeah, and so always still improvements, I'm guessing, kind of constant improving of the algorithms and detection, all that type stuff. Definitely,
because there's, like you were saying, it's artificial intelligence. It can always learn more, right? Yeah. So the more data we collect, the more accurate those models will get.
Orin, when we sat down, I would not have thought that we would have talked for about an hour on all these things. We could probably keep going, but I appreciate your time. I appreciate certainly all the work that y'all are doing there at Cornell. If people are not familiar with the eBird app, the Merlin app, certainly encourage you to look into those. Great partner with Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Of course, the app that we would want you to download first is the Ducks Unlimited app, so make sure you have that on your phone first. Then you can go to the Merlin app and the eBird app, right? Y'all would probably say the opposite, but it's all good. We need all three of them, more of them on there. Really appreciate you being here and spending, I guess, half a day with us here, talking with our staff and then recording this episode here with us. And thanks for sticking around next week for the Science Symposium as well.
I'm looking forward to that, and I've had a great time today hanging out with you guys.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Orin Robinson, research associate and all-around smart quantitative guy, waterfowl hunter at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Appreciate all that he does in a partnership here with Ducks Unlimited. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the great work he does getting these episodes edited and out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time, and we thank you for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.